Hi, it's Professor Mike, and we're going to talk Chapter 11, Internal Control in the COSO framework. COSO is Committee of Sponsoring Organizations, and they're the folks who set up an internal control framework many, many years ago and updated it more recently in 2013. They have set up some good frameworks, and you will be responsible for understanding those for the CPA exam. But in this course, you'll be getting an overview of their kind of internal control framework. I do find it very, very helpful. It is kind of linked in some ways to Porter's competitive analysis. So those of you who are familiar with Porter's work in competitive strategy will recognize some of the structure here. So ultimately, management and the auditor have responsibilities for internal control, but it's really management's responsibility to set up an internal control framework to prevent and detect errors as they occur, whether due to fraud or whether due to unintentional misstatement. So there are going to be limitations to internal controls, and what you want is reasonable assurance, not absolute assurance. You're not going to be able to establish an internal control framework that checks every transaction to an excruciating level of detail. It's simply not cost effective. What you want is things that are going to prevent and detect material misstatements. And remember, in the audit risk model, internal control is management's risk assessment. So management's responsible for inherent risk and control risk, and we as auditors adjust detection risk to do audit procedures based on what the risk of material misstatement, i.e. Inherent risk times control risk, is in order to ultimately get to an acceptable level of audit risk. So in section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley, which when Todd was talking, he talked about the establishment of Sarbanes-Oxley, which established the PCAOB, but also section 404 of Sarbanes-Oxley it established a reporting requirement for public companies. And so management of all public companies are responsible for issuing an internal control report. So there's an acknowledgement that the management team is responsible for maintaining an adequate level of internal control structure, and management is responsible for making an assessment of that internal control structure annually. And that is as of the end of the fiscal year. But practically, you want to know that it was also working throughout the fiscal year, because transactions aren't all recorded at the end of the fiscal year, right? But the reporting is as of the end of the fiscal year. Now, that's signed by the chief executive officer and the chief financial and accounting officer of the company. And then management must assess internal control over financial reporting, both the design and operating effectiveness of those controls. So in many cases, even small public companies will have an internal audit function, whether it's in-house or whether it's outsourced, in order to do these tests. Your external auditors cannot really do these tests, but you can employ other external auditors to do these tests. Auditors are responsible to obtain an understanding of internal control for every audit engagement, whether it's a public company or private company, and report on the effectiveness of internal controls in financial reporting if it's an accelerated filer. An accelerated filer is determined by securities laws, and it's generally companies that have over a certain level of revenues and have been public for a certain amount of time. So I don't want to get into the mechanics and the details of that. You're not going to be quizzed on that specific detail, but accelerated filers are the ones who have an internal control report. The internal control report can be either integrated into the audit report or it can be a separate report. It depends on the client, the accounting firm, um, and what style people want. But ultimately, if you are um, an accelerated filer, the accounting firm must opine on your system of internal controls. For that reason, if you're an accelerated filer, then by definition, you should be reducing your audit work um, because you're going to rely on internal controls. So I'm going to pause here for a second and remind you about the audit risk model. The audit risk model says, as you know from Chapter 9 and earlier, it says that to achieve an acceptable audit risk level of, let's say, 5%, you assess inherent risk, you assess control risk, and then you adjust detection risk based on those two assessments. The reason that you would uh, assess control risk at less than 1 is because you've tested internal controls. You cannot assess internal control risk as less than 1 unless you've tested those internal controls. By definition, with an accelerated filer, in order to issue the opinion that the internal control framework is appropriate and prevents and detects material financial statement misstatements, you are doing that test work. Okay? So if I give you a problem on a quiz that says you're an accelerated filer and you've completed an internal control report, and I ask you to solve for the audit risk model, you know that your definition has to be less than 1 on internal control risk, okay? Um, so here's an example of the report. You've seen it in earlier chapters when we went over financial statement reports. So the COSO framework. The COSO framework basically has has a bunch of different elements. The control environment. The control environment is the overall structure of the company. The actions, policies, and procedures that reflect the attitudes of management, the board of directors, and in cases of a smaller company, the owners of the entity about internal control. And then how do they analyze risk, right? What do they, how do they identify business risk, financial risk, all those kinds of things that prevent them from achieving their objectives. And then the control activities are really things that that address risk, right? So you put in a control. If you sense a risk, you put in a control. So if you think that somebody could potentially steal cash from you, unlikely for material purposes, but if you think about you're a small business owner and somebody could steal cash, you'd probably put in either cameras or a cash reconciliation process or a transaction recording process, something like that. And all of those are controls, right? Um, information and communication. How do you record assets? How do you transmit information? If everything's on paper, it's probably going to break down in some way. Or there may be the ability to accidentally, on purpose, lose paper. So there's different things that can cause internal controls to break down. Finally, monitoring. How do you, we talked about in Chapter 10, setting a tone and having people know that you're watching. That's very, very key. And so if people know that you're going to review stuff, stuff is better. You learn that from your class. You learn that from, being on Zoom and whether people are paying attention to you. If you know that your card's about to be pulled, you are more attentive and ready to ask or answer questions. So here's the structure that I was referring to that has some elements of Porter in here, right? So overlaying everything are the real business aspects, right? There's operations, reporting, and compliance. All these things are routine things that happen in the business. If you look to the right, you can see the levels of the organization, which are the entity, the overall business, then business divisions, which is really important because if you start to think about stuff outside the U.S., right? The further you get away from headquarters, the harder it is to maintain tone at the top, a connection with the corporate business, etc. And the more you rely on local people. And sometimes local business objectives are different than the corporate objectives. So how do you maintain that consistency? And how do you maintain that integrity in a far-flung organization? Then you go down to the operating unit, which is a smaller subset of division, and finally the individual job function. And across all of those, the control environment, risk assessment, control activities, the information and communication aspects, and then the monitoring activities all play a part in keeping those things all together. So again, the parts of the control environment are really risk assessment, control activities, information communication, and monitoring. So how do we do this with information technology? Information technology cannot be treated as a black box. So you can't just say, well, it goes in there, and because it goes into a computer system, an Oracle financial system, something like that, it must come out right. No. As an auditor, you are responsible for understanding what is happening within that system and why, what the process is, and then testing through transaction replication or some other means that what you think is happening is what's really happening. And so companies often, they will create specific IT controls. And there are general controls and application controls. I am going to go to the next slide, and then I'm going to pause for a second and talk about a couple different things. So, if you are a company in Silicon Valley nowadays, you probably rely on software as a service as your main solution for everything from Salesforce.com, which is a customer relationship management tool, to different Atlassian tools, which allow you to do bug tracking, communication, project management, all sorts of things, to accounting systems like NetSuite or Workday, to people systems like Workday, to payroll systems like Gusto, to equity systems like Carta. All these things are things that can be purchased by anyone in the organization. That's the scary part. A subscription can be anywhere from free to several $100s a month per seat. A seat is one user generally. And there are different levels of users within an organization. So when you're looking at the textbook is still back in the dark ages when dinosaurs roamed the earth and I was an auditor. And what they really talk about is things like, okay, you bought a package of software to do your accounting. You bought Oracle. You bought SAP. You spent millions of dollars with an accounting firm or a consulting firm to implement that software. And by implementing the software, you made changes to the software. Those are customizations. With software as a service software, all you can do is configure. And that's different because you're not touching the core code. So, my client that runs Copper, which is a CRM, or QuickBooks Online, is running the same version of QuickBooks Online as every other client. You can't change the core code. What you can change is different options within that code. But you cannot change the core code. So a lot of the things that the textbook talks about are not as relevant in Silicon Valley today. Now, the places where it is relevant are things where your software is actually your business, right? So if you are auditing Apple and your job is to audit iTunes, then all of these controls are appropriate because iTunes is proprietary software, which then runs and requires you to understand it, because how are you going to know that Apple has the right number of iTunes subscribers and that they've delivered digitally all the books and all the music and all the TV shows that they have, that the subscriber has requested or is entitled to? You don't without creating appropriate testing, right? Because all of these things are digital. And you're not going to go out and confirm with every subscriber because they're only paying like $20 a month, right? So you're not going to get material coverage by confirming with subscribers that they're receiving all of their material. So you really have to audit what the system controls are. And this goes for Facebook, this goes for Google, this goes for Salesforce, this goes for Amazon. When you think about all the companies that run software and provide software as a business, these set of controls are important from that business standpoint and for you to be able to recognize revenue, right? Because how do you know that Google actually served the ads that they said they did? You don't. Whereas when I used to audit radio stations, they would have a log of when they ran an ad. And you could look at the log on the ad, and you would actually sit there in the radio station and listen to the ads and make sure that these ads ran at the time that they were supposed to and that it matched the logs. Those things are impossible to do now. So, the general controls are things that prevent unauthorized access or changes to software. So you really want to make sure that nobody can change software without a lot of people knowing and without it being tested. You've seen a lot of different things with airline reservations, with a bunch of different solutions where things have broken because somebody deployed some piece of code into production that shouldn't have been deployed. Oftentimes there'll be a development environment, a test environment, and multiple production environments. And you'll have a production environment that will be your primary one, and you'll have a backup production environment in case the primary goes off. But you won't see that as a user, but a lot of times that's what's available in an iTunes or in a Amazon or anybody who's relying on significant computer systems, right? So you want to make sure that only authorized people have access, and that you have identity management, which is the access to specific things and only specific things within the application. You also want to have some monitoring tools for system crashes and for hacking, right? So these are the things that are general controls. And then specific application controls are within the applications themselves, right? So if you think about cache management, if you think about a specific control in an application, would be things like, okay, only certain roles can apply cache to invoices, right? Only certain roles can generate an invoice. You want the cache application separate from the invoice generation, because if you can create an invoice and apply cache to it, you could completely, you could perpetrate major fraud, right? Payroll application controls, you could create fake employees. So these are the things that you want to have in place. So, when you look at overall general controls, the IT function, separation of duties, who has to do systems development, and who signs off on system changes, physical security, including passwords, things like that. How do you do backups, and how do you administer hardware, right? You used to have racks and stacks of servers. Now you probably run everything on Amazon Cloud, Google Cloud, Microsoft Azure, someplace like that, right? So you're not actually racking and stacking servers unless you're Google or somebody, or Apple or somebody like that. So the hardware aspects are far less important nowadays. But you can monitor Amazon, Google, any of these guys have tremendous monitoring tools to be able to know who's accessed what and what they've done. The application controls are input, processing, and output. So who knows what's happening from an input standpoint? Those could be manual or automated. What processes are done? Specifically, they need to be documented and signed off as to what the application is actually doing, and then who receives the output, right? So, here's a couple tables on the different general controls, and some examples to bring it on home for you. The application controls like input, pre-formatting the screens, very easy, right? But requiring certain information to be input is a form of a control. And then reviewing transactions after they've occurred is, a form of a control. And you can see, you have different pieces of IT in the organization. The people who do the development, the programmers, etc., are not the people that actually run the programs, are not necessarily the people who make the data standards. So, nowadays IT is a bigger and bigger part of your internal control infrastructure, and so you have to understand it, and where appropriate, you have to involve experts. The the access, the chief information officer nowadays is almost a service provider rather than an information officer. And by that I mean they're responsible for making sure that you have access to the network and to the outside world through the internet. They're responsible for establishing data standards to make sure that all the different systems that you have the same taxonomy, so that when you're pulling a piece of information from your CRM system, your customer relationship management system, and you're closing a transaction, that data gets over into your accounting system, so then you invoice the customer appropriately, right? That also relates to integration. So all these systems should talk to each other, and you should know where the breakdowns potentially are between systems talking to each other. Firewalls and encryption are extremely critical, as are just basic data management things. Like, you're going to get some very, very bogus things come across the organization. You get them at San Jose State. You get them a bunch of other places. One major technology company HR person got fooled because she thought she was getting an email from the CEO and asking for a bunch of payroll information. She shared that payroll information. It was not from the CEO. It was from a third party. And they got social security numbers and a whole bunch of stuff. It was not good. But the fact that you can pull down that information and share it is a problem, right? The fact that you can export payroll information and print it is a problem. It may be an inconvenience to not be able to print something. People may like printed materials, but the risk outweighs um, that that inconvenience. And so you have to really think about what the objectives are of the company, what the objectives are of the IT solution, and how that fits into your overall control structure. And like I said, a lot of stuff is on Amazon Cloud or on Google Cloud. So if Amazon or Google goes down, the whole organization can go down. So you have to consider that as part of controls as well. So that's chapter 11, on to chapter 12.